All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us today on this Adopt US Kids webinar, Proactively Preventing Adoption and Guardianship Disruption. I am Britt Cloudsdale, the Family Support Program Manager at Adopt US Kids, and I am joined by Alicia Groh, Adopt US Kids Consultant Extraordinaire. We are pretty tight for time, and we know that this is a very, very important topic for everyone. So we are going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to get us moving forward here. Quickly, before we jump in, some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and it will be shared with all registrants. It will also be posted publicly on the Adopt US Kids website for professionals. And you'll also get a copy of the slides with the recording. So don't feel like you have to furiously jot down any notes or anything. You're going to get all of this handed right back to you. Many of you submitted questions with your registration, which is so wonderful. You're also welcome to submit more questions or the same questions if we don't get to them via the Q&A pod in your control panel. So I just wanted a little note about questions for this webinar. We expect this to be a pretty big sized audience. We had a really big registration list for this webinar, which is so fantastic. We're so excited about it. But with that, we may not be able to get to everyone's questions. So we apologize in advance for that. But please don't hesitate to put your questions into the Q&A pod because that will help us guide our peer meeting discussions that we're having on July 12th and 13th. And it'll also help us guide more content into the future, even if we don't get to your question. So I just really encourage you to do that. And we appreciate y'all taking the time to do this. So we also encourage you to join the chat and engage with each other, or to let us know if you're having technical issues, like if you're having trouble hearing, if your visual goes out or anything like that. It does default, the chat does default to having you just chat with panelists, but you can toggle down on that caret and indicate that you want to chat with everyone so that you can engage with your peers and share ideas and all of that good stuff. So we hope that you'll do that. We also, after this webinar, you will be getting an email from Adopt US Kids Evaluation asking you to fill out a survey about this webinar. So we really hope you'll take 5 minutes to fill out that survey. We really greatly value your feedback, and we do genuinely use all of the feedback we get from post-webinar surveys and post-peer meeting surveys to plan the future content, to make sure that we're delivering the content that you want and that you need most. So please just take a couple minutes to do that. We greatly appreciate that. Okay, very briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who Adopt US Kids is for those that are less familiar, a little bit about our mission. So Adopt US Kids is a project of the U.S. Children's Bureau, and we have a two-pronged mission. The first part of the mission is to raise public awareness about the need for foster and adoptive families for children in the public child welfare system. This webinar, though, is in service to the second part of our mission, which is to assist U.S. states, territories, and tribes in the recruitment, engagement, development, and support of foster and adoptive and kinship families. So you may be more familiar with one or the other, but we have many, many teams. I think it's 7 teams across Adopt US Kids doing really great work across the project. Okay, here, what do we want to accomplish with today's webinar? We primarily want to break down the complex challenge that is adoption and guardianship placement stability. We want to break that down into parts so that you can feel less daunted by the challenge and feel encouraged to take action. We're also going to discuss the risk and protective factors associated with adoption and guardianship stability, and we're going to provide you with strategies for using these factors, these risk and protective factors, to be proactive in preventing adoption and guardianship disruption. We're also going to offer you many, many tips throughout the webinar to start taking action, and to do so even with limited resources. We have several lighter lift suggestions for action steps, things that you can do as a small team or even by yourself to start off with to help you get the ball rolling. And small actions beget larger actions, and you can end up with a snowball. So we really hope that you'll take these suggestions and run with them. That's what we hope for today. A note about language before we dig too far into this. So as we were planning this content, we had some conversations about language because some of the language we use to describe this problem is confusing, both for those that are inside child welfare staff systems, but especially for families and youth and those that are impacted by it. So, and all of these terms are pretty jargony. So number one, I wanted to define these terms for you. And then I just wanted to make a note about these terms. So disruption refers to adoption, or when we're talking about adoption or guardianship, disruption really refers to when the placement disrupts before finalization, before legal finalization or legal guardianship happens. Adoption or guardianship dissolution, easy to say, is talking about when legal permanency, either guardianship or adoption, has already happened. And then post-permanency discontinuity refers to either temporary or permanent out-of-home care after legal permanency has been achieved. Okay, so these distinctions can be helpful for us to talk about internally to child welfare staff, because it can help you kind of understand the problem that you're trying to solve. If you're like seeing something in your data, you want to get precise with the way that you're talking about it. And so we wanted to make sure that you understood these. And then for this webinar, we can assume that we're kind of talking about the umbrella challenge of post-permanency instability, which can include any of these. But, major but, for the families and youth that are involved in these challenges, these are not helpful distinctions by and large, right? Usually these terms, I would suggest just using these terms internally, but acknowledging that any and all of these are harmful results, and any and all of them result in compounded trauma, especially for the young people at the heart of this conversation. So just a note there about language matters, and that we need to be mindful about the language that we're using with families to make sure that it's not overly jargony, and that it doesn't distance us from the very real pain that has been caused as a result of this. We also want to remember our why. This is complicated work that is really important, and it can be really challenging when we're talking about system shift and system change and system improvement. But as we do this, let's remain focused on the families and especially the youth who are impacted by this problem. Disruption and dissolution compounds the trauma experiences of already traumatized young people. And it is also traumatic for the family and for the workers who are supporting the family, not as compounded as the trauma of the young person, but it's traumatic nonetheless, right? And it's easy for us to find ourselves blaming families when adoptions and guardianships dissolve. To be perfectly candid and vulnerable with y'all, I have felt this way in the past, in my past jobs, because it's hard to watch a kid experience that. But these post-permanency disruptions really represent a failure of the system to prepare and support the family appropriately, right? So this is a problem caused by our systems, and it is our responsibility to continuously improve so that they are prevented as much as possible. The adoptive parents or guardians are often, an easy target for our grief, our frustration, our anger on behalf of the child, but directing our limited energy at adoptive parents in that way, who most likely did not have the support they needed, that won't help anyone, and it will make us more jaded about the work that we do, and it'll make us forget our why. So just a note here as we go forward. Outlining this challenge, as we've said multiple times already now, this is a complicated problem, and we're not going to solve it today. Spoiler alert, we're not going to solve it today in one webinar or a couple of peer meetings, but that should not stop us from addressing it. And even when we don't have a clear way to completely solve a problem, we can still act. We can still take those steps to move the ball forward. There's also no way that we're going to talk about everything that relates to addressing post-permanency instability today either, right? This is a really targeted conversation, and it is purposely focused on proactive prevention, meaning focusing on what we can do upstream with what we know about post-permanency instability. When we look at our caregiver engagement and preparation processes, how can we better prevent post-permanency disruption down the line, right? So I just want to make sure that folks are aware that that's kind of the focus of this conversation, but that obviously leaves a lot out, right? So we are looking into, if you guys are interested in having ongoing conversations about this, we can definitely spend more webinars, more peer meetings, more time on this, but I just wanted to make sure that folks were aware of kind of the scope of this webinar before we get started. And really that complex problems call for multifaceted solutions, right? Every person in here is needed to solve this problem. It requires people with different skills and different viewpoints. And during this webinar, we hope to inspire you to take action as we move forward into this challenge. And with that, I do want to make sure that folks are aware we do have a peer meeting, and actually we turned one peer meeting into 2 peer meetings, a peer meeting that is following up on this conversation that we're having today. Y'all are awesome and amazing and have already maxed out the registration for the July 12th peer meeting. So we added another one on July 13th at the same time at 3 p.m. Eastern time. Becky is going to put that link to register for the July 13th peer meeting into chat. If you are interested in doing that, I highly recommend registering now if you are so inclined, because it seems like a really popular topic, which makes a lot of sense. And you're not going to miss out on anything between those two. Those are the same peer meeting, just giving more folks an opportunity to participate. And if you're already registered for the 12th and you'd rather do the 13th, we can get that situated. Just email me. I'll have my my contact info up at the end of the webinar. So with all of that preamble, I'm going to send it on over to Alicia.
Great. Thanks, Britt. So hopefully you're still excited to be here and ready to dive into this topic. As Britt said, we know that this is a big topic, a complex one. And so we're wanting to give you, I think really we're going to give you some encouragement. And as Britt said, some action steps you can try and some ways to think about what you can do with you and your team and your colleagues. So we're going to be dancing through several key concepts in today's webinar, and we'd love to hear from you in the chat about what you're thinking you might try, and we'll be asking about that later in the webinar as well. So we want to start with trying to kind of do a little bit of setting the stage, and one of the questions that we hear very frequently from people in child welfare work is that they're wondering how many adoptions and disruptions, how many adoptions and guardianships disrupt or have discontinuity. And as you may know, we don't really have great data on that. That is something that we struggle with as a sector to know what's really happening. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We won't go into all the nuance for why it's hard to get good data on that. But there's some recent research that's been done. There's ongoing efforts to get estimates. And so the most recent estimates for this is that somewhere between 5 and 20% of the children who exit foster care to permanency through either adoption or guardianship experience some sort of post-permanency instability. And so that's a pretty big range, between 5 to 20%. And that varies probably by part of the country. And if we break it down by age of the youth and other demographics, it probably looks different. But again, that's part of the challenge of this, is knowing what's the scale of this problem. But one thing that I always come back to when we struggle with this data question, or struggle to answer this data question, is whether it's 5% or 7% or 20 or 25%, I think we can all agree that that's too many. And so as we talk about some ideas, we'll talk later in this webinar about some resources that are available to help child welfare systems track that data and think about how to really look at your data in more robust ways to really have a sense of what's happening for disruption and other post-permanency discontinuity. We want to highlight the fact that we still need to be acting now, even if we don't know exactly what the numbers are, that even without being able to measure that, we want to be improving permanency stability for our children, youth, and families. So that's the sort of the data context for this. One thing, as I mentioned, that there has been recent research and a real effort by the Administration for Children and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to look at this idea of post-adoption and guardianship instability. And so there've been some efforts underway for several years now to gather more information about what's really happening around the country with that kind of instability. What are ways that child welfare systems are tracking that information? What are ways that they can have a read on how many children and youth and families are experiencing instability after adoption or guardianship? And so we will highlight a bit later some resources coming out of that study that are really intended to help agencies and child welfare systems gather data in a more robust way, as I mentioned, and that can help inform future planning. But again, in the meantime, we can also be working on addressing factors that are risk factors and protective factors related to permanency really being stable. So we have this question. We'd love to get your thoughts in the chat, and maybe this is just a question for you to be thinking about and maybe checking with your colleagues. But we're wondering whether your jurisdiction, your agency, your child welfare system collects and analyzes data on permanency discontinuity. So reentries into care, moves after a permanent placement for adoption or guardianship. We'd just love to hear what, if anything, your jurisdiction is working on with that. So if you want to share that in the chat, if you have tips on what's working, I'm sure your peers on this webinar would love to hear about what you're doing. Let's go to the next slide. So here we wanted to share a framework that we find really helpful. I know many people find very helpful, and hopefully you've seen this before, but if not, that's fine too. We'll cover it briefly. So this is a permanency continuum that was created by a project funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Children's Bureau. And this is from the National Quality Improvement Center for Adoption and Guardianship Support and Preservation. It's known as the QICAG for shorthand for that center. And so this continuum, I think, is really helpful in lots of ways, but it looks at this idea of what are the services, the supports, the interventions, the activities that we do and that we can do all along the process to help really promote adoption and guardianship stability. And so moving from pre-permanence over on the left side, so that's before we've gotten to a finalization of an adoption or a guardianship, that vertical red bar that denotes the point where we have finalization. And then moving all the way through to what happens after we've, quote, achieved permanency, and looking at what are things that really help prevent instability and what helps stabilize families. I'm not going to walk through the entire continuum. That could be a whole webinar in and of itself. But one thing that I think is really important to note here is that there's a lot that we can be doing and should be doing before we get to the point of an adoption or a guardianship, where we are really setting the stage. We're helping parents set or maybe readjust their expectations about what's realistic, what it means to parent a child or youth who's experienced trauma, understanding what services and supports are available to the family, helping them really explore that, helping them explore their support networks, and doing that so we're really setting families up for success. I know we had a lot of questions in the registration from many of you asking for things about what to do when a family is in that crisis level situation. So all the way over on the far right side of this continuum, where you're probably at a point of needing intensive services and crisis level intervention. And that is certainly crucial to be able to have those crisis intervention services. But we also, for this webinar, we're wanting to highlight this thinking of we need to be doing things all along that continuum, and really probably further to the left on this continuum, to really be recruiting families with clear messaging about what to expect, what it means to adopt or be a guardian for a youth who's experienced trauma, and what it means to really think about the commitment involved there and how to best support that youth. So this will be something that we want you to sort of have in mind in the background as we're talking through things today, and as you think with you and your colleagues about what actions you might be able to take. You could think about what are we currently doing at various points along this continuum, and maybe where are there spots where we could strengthen our preparation, our universal services and information, so information sharing and learning, training for families, all the way through to intensive services to help families when they're getting maybe closer to a crisis level and needing a much more intensive intervention. Let's go to the next slide. So you've heard us talk, I think, just a bit. We've referenced this idea of risk and protective factors. So we're going to dive into that a bit more now. And this is a way of thinking about the topic that I find really helpful. And for me, it offers hope, and it offers some ideas for action steps you can take, which I think we're always looking for. So there is a lot of great insight into the idea of risk and protective factors. So risk factors and protective factors that relate to the stability of permanency. And Becky just put a link in the chat to an article from Child Welfare Information Gateway that goes into these factors in much more detail than we're going to cover today. So I encourage you to check out that article. But the idea is that there are factors based on research that for the risk factors, I think that's a more intuitive concept. The risk factors are factors that may be in place either about the child, about the parent or the family, and about the system, that if those factors are present, we think there's an increased risk of instability for the adoption or guardianship. And so we'll cover more of those in a bit, but those can be things like the age of the child or the level of need, or the parent's expectations, things like that. The protective factors, this is the part that I think really offers a lot of optimism for us. The protective factors are things that can protect against that instability of the permanency. And so that can also be things like the relationship between the parent or caregiver and the child. It can be things about the parent's ability to adapt their parenting style, those kinds of things. So we're looking at this in a comprehensive way of what's that kind of mix of risk and protective factors that can drive up or drive down the possibility of instability in an adoption or guardianship. Let's go to the next slide. So here we have the list, and again, this comes from the article from Child Welfare Information Gateway that's linked in the chat. This is the list of the risk and protective factors, and we've grouped them by child factors, parent factors, and systemic factors. And I want to make a note here that as we're thinking about these, this isn't saying, especially for the child or the parent, that this is somehow their responsibility to manage, especially for the child or the youth. We're not saying these are their factors and they need to somehow be responsible for managing that level of risk or protective factor. But this is just a way to organize these ideas. But as we'll talk through, I think you'll see these are really, they're all about the systems work. And so where responsibility lies for addressing these factors is with our child welfare systems. But this way of categorizing the factors can be helpful in terms of thinking about sort of what's the level of, or where's the focus for trying to do some sort of awareness and maybe some sort of intervention or strengthening of protective factors. So for the child factors, and remember, these are both risk and protective factors, depending on how they fall. These factors include the child's age, the number of placements that they've had prior to this adoption or guardianship, the amount of time spent in out-of-home care, their behavioral challenges or needs, their race and ethnicity, and whether they're placed with siblings. And one thing I want to note, especially about so many of these child factors, many of these are fixed. These aren't things that we can change. Certainly we can't go back in time and reduce the number of placements that the child had, or we can't change what their age is right now unless we delay permanency, but that's not helping things. So there are things that are really fixed in time and fixed of this is what has happened so far. And so it's more that we need to be aware of those and then think about how can we wrap other protective factors around a family. So we can think about that piece of that way of thinking about these factors. Then as we move to the parent factors, there are ones that include caregiver commitment, so sort of the level of commitment to the adoption or guardianship, whether the extent to which the parent has realistic expectations about adoption and guardianship and parenting this particular child or these children. There's also the parental relationship status, so the relationship between the parents or caregivers with each other, and whether there's a kinship relationship between the parent, caregiver, and the child. So again, some of these are perhaps fixed things, static things that the agency or the child welfare system can't address, but many of these are things that we can address, especially as we're looking at who are we recruiting or engaging as kinship caregivers or as adoptive parents, and how are we preparing them? How are we helping with expectation setting? How are we looking into their motivations and their level of commitment and what helps strengthen that for them? And then at the systemic level, we're also looking at things like the access to post-adoption or post-guardianship supports that the family has, and how much information we're sharing with families. The piece about matching, I saw a question somewhere flying by on the chat about matching. The work that a system or an agency does on matching decisions for a parent and child, or for a caregiver and child, is a key piece about the risk or the protective factor. And so that's part of that really thoughtful practice that we need to be doing in child welfare work. The caseworker experience, the level of experience of the caseworker involved in this adoption or guardianship is a factor. And then whether or not there is a subsidy, an adoption or a subsidized guardianship subsidy in place. And so with those, we can think about these at different levels for the work. We're going to dive into more of these in detail and give some thoughts about ways you can address these. We go to the next slide. So as I think I've mentioned, but I want to really highlight and underline this, these categories really are all connected. We struggled to find a graphic that represented this exactly the way we wanted to, because it's not, we don't want you to think about them as silos, even though we know we need to represent them in separate lists, but we want you to think about it in terms of what's the interplay of these. And so, as you'll probably hear me say a lot and hear Britt say a lot today, this is really about how can we think about what risk factors are present, and maybe with it, maybe for example, there are a lot of risk factors for a specific child that you're working with. So then how do we think about bolstering the protective factors at the parent and systemic levels or categories, so that we're really working together in a holistic way to think about what is the overall mix of risk and protective factors, and trying to move that balance so that we have more protective factors working to support permanency stability here. Let's go to the next slide. So this is something you'll hear from us a lot, probably in all of our webinars. But one of the things that we really think is important to highlight here, as agencies or as child welfare systems are thinking about how can we strengthen our protective factors, especially maybe the systemic factors that would be more agency-led, of access to supports and how are we doing matching. We think it's really important, especially if you're looking to prioritize what to work on first or what to work on next, that it's so crucial, as always, to bring in the voices and the expertise of people with lived experience. So youth, young adults, adoptive families, guardians, thinking about what are your pathways for really bringing in their insights and expertise to help inform your decision-making about what to prioritize for example, for protective factors to bolster. Because we can make decisions internally that maybe sound like this is where we should put our efforts, or this is what we want to focus on. But the people who are most directly affected by our work need to be the ones who are informing that decision and helping with that prioritization. Go to the next slide. So we want to dive into now the child factors, and we've mentioned several of them. So this is where we want to give you some ideas for ways that you can keep increasing the protective factors and the protective elements, especially if there are maybe some more risk factors at place with a specific child or group of siblings that you're working with. So one thing that you can do is to work on increasing the ways that you engage and support families who are adopting youth with more risk factors. So this is a little bit of a sort of a mix of thinking about the parent level, but really thinking about that awareness. If you're working on adoptions or guardianships for older youth, youth with more time and care, youth who've had more placements, youth with maybe more complex behavioral needs, which I think, as I've just described, that's what we hear around the country is where we're facing a big need, an increasing need for more adoptive and guardianship families. Then we need to think about, so what do we do once we know that those are the youth that we're trying to achieve permanency for? How can we find families and prepare families who are going to be better suited and a better match for those youth? How can we find people with realistic expectations or help them develop realistic expectations? How can we support them and train them to be able to meet youth's needs? So we can think about that in terms of what do we wrap around those risk factors. Another thing you can do is look at building in some kind of preventative check-ins, some early connections with families, starting before we get to the point of finalization, but building in that routine of we're going to check in regularly, see how you're doing, maybe offer some more ideas for here's an upcoming training that could be really relevant. Here's a support group, or here's a peer connection that would be helpful. That helps prepare families and again, set their expectations, but it also helps normalize the idea of accessing ongoing support. And that we know can help post-finalization as being another protective factor, that they have access to that support. Another great approach is to offer child-specific trainings. And it might not be child-specific about here's exactly how to parent John, but specific to the needs that the child has or the experiences a child has. So if a family is looking at adopting a teen with a specific trauma experience in their past or with specific medical needs, connecting parents with trainings that are really tailored to here's how to address these specific behaviors or these specific backgrounds or these specific medical needs. And I just want to make a quick note here about a great resource also funded by the Children's Bureau. The National Training and Development Curriculum for Foster and Adoptive Parents has great training resources. It's free curriculum available to everyone. But one specific thing that they have within that is something they call right time training, which is just what it sounds like. When you need a training right now on a specific topic, here's something you can access that's not a full, multi-day kind of training. It's maybe a half hour or a brief training video that you can get online and for families, and it helps look at things like addressing specific behaviors. So being able to tap into those kind of resources to help families is a great one. I'm seeing questions about the training. So Britt, maybe you can put it in the chat, but I'll say it again. The acronym is NTDC, so the National Training and Development Curriculum for Foster and Adoptive Parents. So it's a great one to check out for lots of resources, but that right time training can be a great way to really improve and add to your training offerings for families. And then this piece about placing siblings together, we talked briefly about the child factor of whether siblings are placed together, that can be a protective factor or a risk factor. This is something, but I think knowing that actually affects the risk or the protection against the risk of instability can be really helpful as we think about how can we make it work to place siblings together, and going beyond just knowing that it's a good thing to do in most of our cases for our youth, but thinking about that in and of itself can be an action that we take to help increase the likelihood of permanency stability. So looking at what are the barriers to doing that in your system or with specific children and youth, and what are some ways you can work through that can be a great strategy. Next slide. Great. So this is a topic that I get very passionate about. We're passionate about this whole webinar topic, but this is one where I think it's really important to think about the protective element and the protective factor of having children be connected with their culture and their community, and that in and of itself helps protect against permanency instability. And so as you're looking to increase the true permanence of permanency, the increasing use of kinship care is a great way to work towards that. It's a great way we can keep our children and youth connected to their culture and to their communities. We can also do this through our work on diligent recruitment. And so with the goal really of diligent recruitment efforts being to build and sustain that group of families who reflect the race and ethnicity of the children who are in foster care, then that helps increase the likelihood that the families that we are finding for our children and youth for adoption or guardianship, increase the likelihood that those families will be part of our children's communities and culture. So you can think about this as really good diligent recruitment work also helps build in protective factors in addition to doing really good kinship care efforts to keep children connected with their youth or with their culture and their community. Next slide. So we have a couple of articles, resources that we think are helpful, and we want to highlight this as ways you can take action, and this can be a great way to dive into this with your colleagues. One is that we have an article on the Adoptive Kids website, and we should note all of our resources are free. So as we're highlighting things here, please feel free to use them and share them widely. So we have an article that is called "Recruitment Alone Isn't Enough." And so it talks about the importance of being really culturally responsive as you engage diverse families and think about what is that process beyond the recruitment efforts and the community outreach, but sort of what next, what happens after we recruit families initially. So it's a great article to help you think about that for building that group of families that reflect the race and ethnicity of kids in care. And then we have a cultural competence assessment tool to help you examine your family support services and the extent to which those services are culturally competent. So it's a great tool for diving in and really doing that kind of self-assessment of your support services. And hopefully that will then prompt some more action steps for you. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Britt. Britt, I knew I took a little longer than planned there, so take it from here.
I took a little longer also, so here we are. Thank you, Alicia. Okay, so let's talk about addressing the parent factors that are associated with post-permanency stability. So when we were talking about going upstream to address these issues, we were really talking about going all the way upstream to looking at who are we recruiting, as Alicia was just talking about, right? So several of the parent factors, right, allude to qualities that we have long known make for good foster and adoptive parents, right? Things like flexibility, a willingness to learn, self-awareness, realistic expectations, a sense of humor. So there's a significant role that your recruitment efforts play in preventing post-permanency disruption down the line. This also means that we are doing ourselves no favors when we move families forward, even when we have reservations about their ability to care for children with complex trauma histories. So supervisors, this question is really for you. How are we coaching our staff when they have to have a difficult conversation with the family, right? When there's a concern about something, or we're not sure that this family has realistic expectations about what it means to parent a teen, or realistic expectations about what trauma, the impact of trauma on the developing brain and how that impacts behavior. And we're in the midst of pre-service training, and we're just not sure how to move forward with this family. And we're often really hesitant to have these crucial conversations with prospective families, often because we are in a perpetual recruitment crisis, right? We don't want to lose a family, but having uncomfortable conversations early can help us prevent major problems and major traumatic placement disruptions later on. And this can be done in such a way that it's really a learning opportunity for families, right? If you're concerned about a family in one particular way, it's okay, let's get them more resources. Let's get them more support in this area. And really, it's something that we could be communicating to all families of that we all have, and this is something that is contained within the foundations of NTDC that Alicia was talking about. All families have areas of strength, competencies of strength, and competencies where they need more growth and need more support and training. And so if everybody has that, everybody is then encouraged to do more ongoing self-assessment of I really need to dig deeper into this topic that is going to help me down the line, or I really need to look at my support system and educate my support network on what it means to experience developmental trauma or something like that, right? That's where that's really one of the main things that we could do is be looking at who is coming in the front door when we're talking about prospective adoptive families. And that's a concrete way that we could be working toward preventing adoption disruption. We also need to be listening to the voices of parents and kinship caregivers and guardians to hear about what helps them actually feel sufficiently prepared and supported, right? That was one of the systemic factors, was that they have access to sufficient post-adoption and post-guardianship support. Well, what does that look like? What does that mean? And also, what are their specific concerns about their ability to sustain permanency, right? This type of listening and getting feedback from caregivers, this needs to happen on both the individual family level, right? On okay, as you're considering adopting John, let's have ongoing conversations about what you need to be successful in this adoption. What are you most concerned about when you are thinking about your own skill set and that kind of thing. But it also means, in addition to that individual level, it also means taking a broader systemic approach, at looking at the systemic level, right? Family input and caregiver input and young adult input should guide the decisions that we're making about the support services that we provide in general, right? So that we're providing families that the support that is in line with what we know that they need, right? So that's an important piece of listening to families, is also ensuring that families feel comfortable sharing their vulnerabilities and challenges with you, right? Several of the questions that were included with registration for this webinar revolved around how do I get families to reach out before they're in crisis? How do I get families to reach out before they're saying they're done? How do I get families to engage before it's a dire situation, right? There were so many questions about that, and makes sense, absolutely makes sense, because that's when families are often presenting themselves, right? Is when things are all the way into the need for intensive services, right? And part of the answer to that, it's not a simple answer, but part of the answer to that is we need to make sure that we are creating environments where they want to reach out to us about their challenges, where we can offer timely, relevant resources and support. Our relationship with families for much of their experience is as the arbiter of if they are good enough to care for these children, right? We are approving them and licensing them and giving them the thumbs up on moving forward. And so if I've bent over backwards to convince Alicia that I can care for this child that I want to adopt, and then 6 months in, a year in, 3 years in, I'm really struggling, am I going to go back to Alicia to tell her that I'm struggling and I need help? If I fear judgment from her or from her colleagues, if I fear that she will find fault with my entire family, not just the child that I'm struggling with, right? Am I discouraged from reaching out when I'm struggling a little bit, right? It's really, I'm then encouraged to wait until things are really, really bad, until I am actively in crisis and I'm done. But if Alicia has been reaching out to me this entire time and telling me the common behavioral challenges that might be right around the corner as my child turns 10, turns 15, connecting me with resources, connecting me with other adoptive parents or guardians, and asking about what I need to succeed, well, I'm much more likely to reach out to her or to others at her agency when I'm having a hard time and when I'm struggling with a specific challenge. So now, as I say all that, I know that there is limited bandwidth for that kind of outreach, right, at all of our agencies. But it may be time to invest more heavily in that kind of post-permanency relationship building because of how early intervention is connected so much with post-permanency stability, right? So I've mentioned already about encouraging ongoing self-assessment for prospective caregivers. And we mentioned NTDC and right time training is available in here as well. We often hear, and I think I saw this in the registration questions as well. Well, families learn all of this stuff in pre-service, right? We're throwing so much stuff at them in pre-service, but they don't remember when the time comes. They don't remember, when they're actually facing that situation with that child. And I don't think I would either, because especially for parents and adoptive parents and guardians, they might be encountering these behavioral challenges years and years after their placement with their child was legally finalized or their guardianship was finalized. So I would love to know if anybody is using NTDC in this way around the right time trainings, because that's what the right time trainings are designed for, of like making sure that families have access to the information they need at the time that they need it. So if anybody is using NTDC in this way, we'd love to hear about it. I'm sure your peers would love to hear about it. So if you could go ahead and put that in the chat, that would be amazing. We also need to always be engaging youth in family finding so that they are permanently placed with kin whenever possible. Kinship relationships are a protective factor. And Adoptee's Kids actually has a resource called Beyond the Search, and that gives guidance on supporting the relatives that are identified through family finding. I will put that link in the chat because I think I failed to give Becky that link. But that is a really helpful resource to kind of think through what comes after the family finding efforts that you're doing to find permanency for a child. It's what needs to happen as you're helping that family engage with the reality of what it would mean to parent and ongoing care for this child. Okay, so another action step, a concrete action step here. We've talked a lot about how your diligent recruitment plans and your recruitment efforts are directly connected to your ability to prevent post-permanency instability. So that would be a good action step. Maybe as a team or a broader work group, you take the time to make sure everybody in your agency knows what's in your diligent recruitment plan. Does everybody know what's in there? And what data was used to develop your diligent recruitment plan? What data was missing? Do you need to collect more or different data to better guide your recruitment efforts so that you're recruiting the right families based on the needs of the kids in foster care in your system? Adoptee's Kids has a very handy dandy tool called the Diligent Recruitment Navigator. And I can say this as somebody who's used it on the other side and before I joined Adoptee's Kids. It is really, really useful. It is a tool that is building something for you as you're entering the information into the system. So I would really encourage you to take a look at that. And we'll make sure everybody has access to that as we're going forward. And you can always also reach out to Adoptee's Kids for support on this topic as well, to do capacity building support with you. We also, another action step is to seek caregiver input, right? So maybe you're already doing this and you want to look at ways to do it better or do it more often, or maybe you're not doing this yet, and that's okay. Let's look for ways that we could start to continually seek feedback from the caregivers, the adoptive parents and the guardians that are interacting with your system. So you could start by looking at the ways that you're already engaging families. Like, for example, we have heard from several states that their main contact with families post permanency is in the context of subsidy payments, right? Like they're getting these subsidy payments every month. So they at a minimum have access to families in that way. And so let's see if we could leverage that contact that's already happening and maybe build that into a survey about their support needs or their challenges that they're experiencing. There's also really great value in doing listening sessions. A lot of states do like regional listening sessions, maybe like once a year, once every 2 years. There's a lot of value in that. You could also reach out to existing advisory groups or your foster and adoptive parent associations to help to get their help in gleaning this information from families, right? They are already engaged with families in a way that maybe you need to leverage or would like some support in. Also, inviting adoptive parents and guardians to participate in work groups on these issues is a fantastic way of making sure that you're not just seeking feedback one time and that it's not this thing that is a checkbox and that we're done with it. If you have members of the community that are caregivers, that are folks with lived experience, adults with lived experience in foster care or adoption or kinship care, those folks to have them participating in ongoing work groups, it helps you continue to have these conversations. Work groups always at least make it so that you're continuing to talk about things that can often get backburnered, right? The stuff that because we all are very familiar with what crisis looks like in our industry. And so work groups at a minimum can help you prioritize them. And when you have folks with lived experience and when you have caregivers and guardians on those groups, they can make sure that they're holding you responsible for the stuff that you said you were going to do and making sure that the needs of these families are prioritized, right? You can also always do interviews, right? You can always do individual interviews or small group interviews with families to get the information that you need in order to help them. This is also something that you could do to help you improve your relationship that your agency has with the family, right? It's both a data gathering tactic and an outreach tactic, an engagement tactic. So no matter what method you use, make sure that you're closing the feedback loop. And what that means is make sure that you're not just gathering a bunch of information and then the people that took the time to tell you about what their challenges were or what their needs were, then they hear crickets from you. They never hear back from you ever again. So, and that's a really important thing that Alicia and I talk about all the time, is closing the feedback loop. And the way that you would do that, it doesn't mean that you have to reach out individually to every person who did a survey or anything like that. It means you're saying, okay, we did this survey, we had these listening sessions, here are the top 3 things we learned, and here is our goals that we're going to do in the next 2 years, 3 years, whatever the situation is, to address those, right? And even just doing that really serves it does a lot in terms of fostering trust with the community at large, right? So I'm going to talk in detail now about supporting kinship caregivers. Placement with kin is a protective factor. And like the placement with siblings, we know this. We've been known this, right? We know that kinship placements are less likely to disrupt. They result in fewer placement moves for kids. They maintain more cultural, familial, and community connections. They maintain sibling and birth parent relationships more consistently. And the list goes on and on and on. So what is stopping us from placing with kin every time or as often as we possibly could? Some strategies to try to ensure that you place with kin as often as possible is making sure that you offer kin specific supports, right? And so that means helping families, sorry, that was my cat knocking over everything, helping families navigate the changing family dynamics, right? Moving from grandma to primary caregiver, right? Moving from auntie to the person who is the one who's sending you to your room, right? And so the family dynamic changes. There's also a lot of good reason to invest in kinship navigators, right? People that we're talking about the support that is necessary after family finding, right? Kinship caregivers are, they are presenting themselves in the midst of what is most likely a family crisis, right? That a child who's in their family is in foster care and is not able to return home. So a kinship navigator can help them navigate all of these different things to make sure that they have access to the support and resources that they need. And then kin-specific support groups is something that's really, really important. I think that I'm surprised that Alicia and I didn't put peer support in here, because we usually do, because peer support is really, really effective in all ways, but kin-specific support, especially, you want to make sure that your kinship caregivers are not in support groups where adoptive parents are sharing, challenges with birth family, and like they're talking about people like my child, like my daughter, or whatever. So it can be really important to make sure you're having kin specific supports. You also want to, as often as possible, be providing parity in available subsidy and support to guardians, right? Adopt US Kids did a survey through 2021 where we gathered information on the post-adoption and guardianship support programs across the country. One theme that we saw that is positive, that is really great, is that guardians were more often included in access to publicly funded post-permanency support. That's great. The less good news that is associated with that is that they often have more hoops to jump through in order to get access to that support than their adoptive parent counterparts have to jump through. And what I mean by that is we found that guardianship support was often tied to a subsidy agreement, and that guardians also often have more hoops to jump through in order to access subsidy, period, right? They have to have gotten their license within X amount of time. They need to be parenting this specific type of child in order to access the subsidy or what have you. So that is something that I think all systems should be looking at as they're looking to, look at addressing post-permanency stability. Can we make sure that guardians have access to the same level of support that post-adoption families do? The other piece that I really want to make sure folks are aware of is you could be getting more kinship families licensed potentially. The Children's Bureau, I think it was right at the end of 2020, the Children's Bureau issued a memorandum on licensing, non-safety licensing waivers for kin, and had guidance within that. And I'll put that in the chat as well. But I would definitely recommend taking a look at that and taking a look at your licensing requirements and seeing if there are more waivers that could be put in place for kinship caregivers, right? Looking at are all of these licensing requirements that are not associated with child safety, are they all absolutely necessary? Or are there ones that we could waive specific to the circumstances? So with that, I'm going to send it back over to Alicia.
Sorry, little delay in getting my camera to turn back on. So one of the things that we are highlighting here as sort of a theme, I don't know if you're seeing this as a theme, but this idea of the importance of the relationships. And so we talked about it with kinship caregivers, we talked about it with children being placed with their siblings. I think this idea that strong relationships really are protective as well, I think is an important thing to think about, especially if we're maybe looking at a high number of risk factors being at play. And so thinking about the fact that strong relationships, especially between the caregiver or parent and the child or youth, that is really crucial. And so we can think about what that means for preparation of both the family and the youth, and that might be preparation separately as well as together, and helping the parent or caregiver and the youth really explore what are their questions, maybe uncertainty, concerns, and how do we address those, and how do we really help strengthen that attachment and that connection between the caregiver and the child. So that's a great way to think about another piece that you can be doing, as we think sort of what's that more upfront work. This is getting closer to that finalization of an adoption or a guardianship, but if we can think about how to really strengthen that relationship itself. Sometimes I think that gets lost in our work because we're thinking about all of the other procedural pieces, but sort of fundamentally, and we know this, that relationship is so key. So we do have a webinar that can be helpful for you to look at. It might be a great thing to talk about with your team, whoever you think of as your team. Maybe it's the team you supervise or your colleagues, your leadership team. But this could be a great webinar to watch the recording of, and then talk through, what does this mean for us? How can we use some of these ideas? So the webinar is on stabilizing placements through relationships. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so now thinking back to earlier in the webinar, as we had that framework for our protective factors, we've talked about child factors, Britt just talked about parent factors, and so now I'm moving to that column, that part of the pie of systemic factors. And this is where I think it's really helpful to think about both, as we've talked about child and protective factors. We've been wanting to highlight things that you can do as an agency or as a child welfare system. So in that way, these all require systemic interventions or responses, but these are really these systemic factors that we talked about for things like access to post-adoption or post-guardianship support, access to subsidy, really having better data about what's happening. So we're wanting you to think on these different levels. So as you think about addressing systemic factors, we have several suggestions I'm going to bring in here, and I'm going to share some examples from child welfare systems. I'm going to touch on them briefly, but you can get more detail in an article that we have on our website. We'll include that link as well. So I'm just going to give sort of a brief peek into some of those things. We anticipate you may have more questions about what each of the states did. And so you can find out more in our article on our website about this. One of the strategies that you can do to take action is to really bring in consideration of risk and protective factors when you're making those matching decisions between youth and families. And so we know that the quality of that match is so important for the success and the stability and well-being of the family. And so one way to do that is to really look at how do we incorporate information about risk factors and protective factors into that matching process and that matching decision-making. So Vermont really took an intentional approach to this, and they created a database of, I believe it's 35 risk and protective factors. And they're really working on building that information about the impact of those risk and protective factors. And then they're also really looking at how do we use that? How do we train staff? So they have trained their staff on how to use those factors in making matching decisions. And looking at that in terms of, for example, if we know that there are these specific risk factors at play in this potential match, what protective factors do we have? Do we think this is going to be success, or do we need to do more preparation of the family? Or is there too much of an imbalance between the risk factors and the protective factors that would mean that this really isn't a good match? So looking at that as a way to put some more kind of structure and some more framing to the decision-making about matching can be really helpful. Another great way to think about that is in using those risk and protective factors for making matching decisions. You can use that not just to the point of thinking about, yes, we're going to match this child or this sibling group with this family, but there's a next step. You can say, based on what we now know from looking at this and having this awareness of the mix of risk and protective factors in place for this potential family, what support services, what additional preparation, what additional support should we put in place? So it can help inform a support plan or a service plan or some additional conversations to have with the child or youth and with the family. And so thinking about that it's not just a point in time for making the matching decision and then we don't think about it again, but it's really more, how do we set this family up for success going forward and make sure that they are connected to, for example, the peer support that would be helpful, or additional trainings on specific needs, or maybe a buddy system where they could have someone who can help them continue to set their expectations to be realistic. Another approach that you can use is really continuing to gather data. We know that we heard a lot earlier on in this in the chat, or we saw it in the chat, that some of you are collecting some data on post-adoption and post-guardianship instability. Some aren't, or some maybe have some, but you have gaps. I think we know that it runs the whole continuum. But think about ways to collect data on that, partially just so that you have better data, but also so that it can really inform your planning and prioritization for next steps, for services, for addressing risk factors, maybe for adjusting how you're doing your recruitment messaging and your preparation of families. One example of doing this is in Georgia. They did really in-depth case file reviews of situations where there was post-permanency instability. So if a child had been adopted from foster care and then re-entered foster care, they really did a deep dive into these files to look at what happened here, and not in a blaming way, but really in a trying to understand and learn from it, and a continuous quality improvement approach. And so looking at things like, what was the dynamic early on in this adoption? How long has it been since the adoption? what services and supports did the family access? At what points in the timeline? What supports maybe did the family try to access, but that they weren't able to? What barriers did they encounter? Was it a long wait list? Was it there wasn't availability anywhere in their area? Geographic barriers? Were there cost barriers? But what was the experience? What did the family try at various times to help stabilize and sustain the permanency? And then what happened once that no longer worked and once the child came back into foster care? And so using that kind of approach, you could do a similar look to say, here's what we're learning. Maybe it turns out that families are trying to access trauma-informed therapy early on, but they're not able to because there aren't enough trauma-informed and adoption competent or permanency competent therapists in their area. Or maybe there are language barriers to accessing appropriate supports and services. Or maybe the family didn't reach out and didn't try to access services. And that tells us something about work that we need to do up front to help normalize connection to support for families. So it's a way to collect data on both the rate of discontinuity after adoption or guardianship, but it's also a way to really understand how can we strengthen our supports and our practices to help bolster this and help prevent future disruptions and dissolutions. Another thing you could do is really look at the supervision and coaching for your caseworkers to help them gain deeper insights and increase their ability to be on the lookout for maybe early signs that a family is perhaps at increased risk of permanency instability. And so that's something that is nuanced and is part of that art of social work. And so some places may look for things like, can we have checklists or an easy sort of diagnostic piece. I think there are probably places trying to develop some ways to look for those early signs. But some of this could start with helping your supervisors and caseworkers understand risk and protective factors and how those may show up and how there might be indicators that something is at play. But looking at ways to really build that skill level of your workers can be a key way to look at maybe some earlier interventions and help before a situation gets to the point of really being that crisis level. And then another piece that can be really helpful here is improving the quality and accessibility of your post-adoption support services. There are a lot of strategies, of course, that could be used to do that. That can include increasing funding, which may make many of you laugh as I say that, but that's, of course, a key part of this. But also really looking at how do you know what the quality and accessibility of your support services are? Do we have a good understanding of what quality they have? How many of them are trauma informed and how many of them are linguistically accessible? What's the geographic access to these services? What's the wait list and how long is the wait time for various services? So one thing you can do for this is to make use of another resource from Adopt US Kids. We'll mention it probably a few times here, but our support services assessment tool is another great tool for doing an agency-wide, really a system-wide self-assessment to look at your support services, your family support services that you offer in various categories of support, from basic to enhanced to intensive services, and looking at them across the domains of quality and accessibility. And so that includes things like, are they linguistically accessible? Are they geographically accessible? Do they have the quality in terms of really having that trauma-informed lens and being adoption and permanency competent? So it looks at different dimensions within quality and accessibility and helps you, along with your stakeholders, do an assessment and essentially a rating of those services and see where are we really strong. Maybe we have services that are really high quality, but they're not accessible to everyone. So maybe we want to look at expanding access. Or maybe we have a lot of access to key services, but they're not quite at the quality level we want. So how could we bump that up? So it's a great way to think about how to connect the dots there and see what's the really picture of our whole support services array. Another idea here sorry, Britt, one more point on that note. One of the things I want to mention is an approach that North Dakota has used, where I think in shorthand, they talk about it as sort of the dental model. We hope that's not triggering for anyone, but the dental model is the idea that we go to preventive visits every 6 months for many of us to the dentist to sort of stay ahead of possible problems. And so the idea of we want to help connect the families with access to services that we have and get ahead of things before we get to a crisis level. In North Dakota, they started this model as they're leading up to adoption finalization, connecting families with workers who really lead the post-adoption support services, making that a warm handoff so there's a relationship there. But then the worker continues a check-in with the family every 6 months for the first 2 years after the adoption. And so the idea there is, ahead of time, we're checking in. This isn't us, trying to monitor you. This really is a friendly check-in and to see how are things going, to talk about, as Britt mentioned earlier, you're coming up on the child being this age. This is a normal kind of developmental stage where you may encounter some of these behaviors, but also being able to say, okay, it's been another 6 months, are you looking for any resources on working with schools, or are you needing to connect with peer support, or here's some options of things coming up. So it's proactively offering those kind of services and helping, again, normalize the access to support. So it's a great one to think about of how can we sort of stay ahead of things before we get to a crisis level and think about it in that preventative approach. All right, next slide. Great. So for this one, we want to really talk about the idea of how can you keep building on successes and having this continuous quality improvement. I think thinking about it as how can we keep learning and where can we go next? And I think especially as staff and leaders and systems are busy and seems like busier than ever, it's helpful to think about what are maybe some smaller steps that you can take, because some of this may feel really big. So you can think about, for those of you who noted that you are collecting some data on adoption or permanent or guardianship discontinuity, you can look at what is the data you currently collect. What do you have? What's missing? And maybe you can't collect everything that you want, but what's a next step? What's maybe one more thing we could collect, or one more way we could look at the data? It may be that you're gathering the data, but don't have a process for really analyzing that. Another step that you could look at doing is thinking about the risk factors and the protective factors that we touched on briefly and that are covered in more detail in the article from Child Welfare Information Gateway. Think about, do you want to incorporate that into training for your staff and for your families and caregivers, so that there's that increased awareness of what are the factors that are at play here for risk of instability and protecting against instability, and maybe have some discussions then with staff and with families about how could you kind of pull these levers and think about, okay, how do we increase some of the protective factors, or how do we be really mindful when we're seeing a lot of risk factors at play. Another idea here, and this ties to Britt's mentioned earlier about having some work groups, you could create a permanency stability work group and really have this be something that you put concerted effort into. I always note when you're creating a work group, it's helpful to really have a clear mandate. What is the group intended to do? Is there a lifetime, a life cycle for this work group? Or is this something that is, ongoing and will just be a continued part of the agency? That can set different expectations. But think about how to create a work group, or a specific, maybe it's a working group with a specific task and a closeout date. But to really think about how do we make the idea of permanency stability really a priority, and how do we keep this front and center so that people are having these conversations and going beyond thinking about it and maybe looking at the data to saying, what do we really do about it? How do we make improvements? Let's go to the next slide. So we've mentioned a while ago now on this webinar, I mentioned the project that was being done by the Administration for Children and Families Office of, now do I remember? OPRE. I have to now come up with the acronym. They put together this post-adoption and guardianship instability toolkit as part of their project. And this toolkit, we have it linked in the chat here. The toolkit offers various tools, various ideas for how you can really focus on ways that agencies and systems can track instability, post-adoption and guardianship instability. So for those of you looking for maybe some new strategies or some new tools for tracking that, that's an option. You can look through the toolkit and see if anything would help. Some of the things that came up in that post-adoption and guardianship instability study was things like challenges where a child may have a unique identifier while they're in foster care, and then once adopted, that gets delinked from the child. And if they re-enter care later, we can't link back to their previous file. So there isn't a way for data systems to know that this is a child who was in care previously, or there isn't an easy way. It was just one example of some of the things that the toolkit is looking to address. But there are several other ideas and strategies in the toolkit. So there is a whole user guide for that toolkit. And then I believe it's an Excel spreadsheet with several data sheets that you could use and adapt for your system. Another thing you can do, as I mentioned just a bit ago, you could use our Adoptive Kids Support Services assessment tool and look at that service array that you have for your family support services and see what's the quality and accessibility of our services, and do we want to have an action plan that says, here's what we're going to prioritize. Again, we would say based on the input from people with lived expertise, so your families and your youth, saying it may be we have this gap, but maybe they're saying it's more important to increase access to this great service over here than to focus first on filling a gap for a service that families might say is less of a need. So that's a key place to look at. How are we making those decisions for our action plan? But that tool can be a really helpful way for you to begin looking at what is your service array and how are you meeting those family support needs. Next slide. So I said, I think early on as we were starting this webinar, we were going to ask you to be thinking about what are some things that you could do? What are some action steps? Maybe take some of these ideas that we're sharing that might feel big or too big and break them into smaller things that you could do. So we'd love to have you share any thoughts in the chat that you've been having so far about something you're wanting to try, something you're thinking about, or maybe a question to your peers here about, has anyone tried doing this? But this is a chance for you to really take a few moments as we're heading towards the final, 20 minutes of this webinar, and think about what are some ways you could take 1 or 2 or 3 of these ideas we've shared maybe and break them down into smaller action steps. Some ways that may be helpful to think about it would be what's something that you can do on your own. So maybe it's you want to look at a couple of the resources that we highlighted and see what that prompts for your thinking. Or what are things you can do with your team? Is it maybe we want to pull files from families where we've recently had adoption or guardianship instability and do kind of a mini version of what Georgia did, do a deep dive into the files and see what does that tell us about the journey and the pathways that our families went through before they got to the point of disruption or dissolution. So you think about what else could you do as a team? Could you watch some of this webinar or other recorded webinars and have a team discussion about where would we want to put our efforts to really focus in on this topic as an agency or as a system? And sometimes we think it's helpful to break things down into what's something you could do, I'll say this month, but this month is almost over, within the next month, or within the next quarter, or within the next year. And so it gives you different scales of action steps that you can think about. Because really the key here is building some momentum and taking some of those ideas with you from this webinar. All right, Britt, I think I'm handing back to you and we're going to dive into questions and answers, right? But questions at least, hopefully we have answers.
Right. Yes. We'll promise the questions, but no. Okay.
Yeah.
A couple of, I wanted to make sure as you were talking about the support services assessment tool, I had put this in chat, but folks are also, I've been doing some demos for some, system specific folks who are interested in learning more about it. If you're like, oh, that sounds cool, but also daunting, please reach out. And I'm happy to give you guys or your team a demo of kind of how the tool works. Me and Alicia really love the support services assessment tool. So we get really excited about it. But it is a really useful tool that you can kind of customize to what you need. So yeah, some questions. We had a bunch of great questions come in at registration, which I really appreciate. Alicia, do you have that sheet handy? We can maybe start there. And folks, you are welcome to put Q&A that you have in the Q&A pod. And yeah.
Yep. So here's one question that I think is a great one for probably, I don't know if everyone on this webinar is facing this, but I think it's probably widespread. So one question was how to get services in underserved areas that could prevent the disruption of adoption.
I love that question because, so often all of our resources are stacked in metro areas, right? Something that I wanted to share around that was a specific state, Colorado, in their RFP or however you call it, in their 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 bid to apply for post-adoption support services. They actually included in there that all applicants had to have a plan for addressing folks in rural communities, and that those communities would be identified first in the rollout of the post-adoption support services. So I thought that approach is really cool. Colorado is a system that they have one contractor working throughout the state, and they also have really broad eligibility in their post permanency support, in that they include not only guardians, but also reunified families are included in their post permanency support as well. So in speaking about addressing folks in rural communities, that is one way that a public agency could kind of, even if you're not sure how to do it, you could put that in, if you're having folks, if you have contractors who are needing to, bid for your next grant, your next post-adoption support program grant, maybe consider that, okay, these are the areas that we know are underserved. What is your plan, potential contractor, for addressing that? Maybe that means that you're looking specifically at contractors who already have support services that are available in those areas, right? So that's definitely something to look at within that. Alicia, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. So one is, I think it's great for people to think about, is there a way to sort of build on or adapt the approach that Colorado did, and think, the rural area is one category that we often hear in terms of being underserved areas. But I think thinking about what are those pockets or those areas, and it might not be geographic areas, but where are there underserved communities or families, and think about that in that broad way. And so that's where I think looking at things like, are primarily Spanish speaking families underserved in your communities, or people who maybe don't have reliable internet access? Is that an underserved population in terms of the way that services are delivered? And so I think that's an important thing, is to think about who has access to services, whether that's geographically, whether that's maybe based on demographics or language, or what's available on public transportation. I mean, there are all of these ways to think about access and how that connects to being served or underserved. Another thing that I think is helpful to think about, it's sort of in addition, so another pathway that could be used in addition to doing it through contracting and requests for proposals, is to look at, once you have identified who are where are the communities, or who are the people who are underserved for post-adoption or post-guardianship services, and look at what groups, what organizations are already serving those communities, and can we partner with them? Especially if it's looking at how can we reach people who are perhaps reasonably uncomfortable reaching back out to the child welfare system. Maybe they don't want to get services through us as the agency, but looking at, are there community centers, are there faith communities, are there various other groups that are working where we're trying to reach people? We talk about this a lot on the recruitment side of the work, of how can you connect with people who are already working in those communities that we want to reach for recruitment. But I think thinking about it on the support side, and looking at, there are all sorts of community organizations and really well-respected and trusted organizations and groups in the communities we're trying to reach. And so how can we partner with them to get services and get support to families and communities that may be underserved?
Yeah, and you can also look at the cultural competence assessment tool, which I admittedly wish we'd named something different, because I think it gets beyond cultural competence within that. But because you might have lots of services that are de facto inaccessible because they are not culturally relevant or accessible to the families that you aim to serve. And one way that you would maybe look at that is look at the populations of people that you're serving. It would then give you information about the populations that you are missing if you're looking at the overall populations within your jurisdiction.
All right, Britt, another question that we had from people registered. One was, as professionals, how do our attitudes and outlook and communication affect the success of placements? So there's a big important question.
I love this question so much because it really gets at the role that all of us play, at any role that we have in factoring into placement stability overall, but especially permanency stability. The way that we talk about adoptive parents and guardians, the way that we talk about the youth that are in foster care, the language we use, it all matters because it all trickles down into how parents perceive the kids in their care. And it also affects the way that we do our jobs. As we were talking, like at the very beginning of the webinar, if you can think back that far, you can think back that far. And when we were talking about the why, I was, when I think about this issue, I really think about how I was as a frontline staff person doing this work in public child welfare, and how angry and frustrated I would get with parents who didn't get it, didn't understand. Oh, we went over this, right? And I think what can be really, really helpful, and this is something that has taken me years to kind of unpack too, is the radical empathy that is required to continually engage in this work. That we all need radical empathy for the why parents don't want to come back to DSS when they're having a challenge. I can understand that. Or like when the radical empathy that we want parents and caregivers to have for children who are engaging in really challenging behaviors, right? Who are raging through the night and who are, those really, really challenging behaviors. We want everyone to have radical empathy for the sake of the kid at the center of this. And so I think that as frontline staff, as supervisors, as program managers, the way that we can impact a lot of this, even, just by ourselves, is in the way that we approach the families that we're working with, the way that we talk about them. If we are calling in our coworkers around but I can understand the challenge that this family is having, even though it's manifesting in this really unfortunate way, right? Like, I think that matters so much. And I really appreciate that question, because I think it gets at something kind of a squishier thing that is maybe not as much as what we spent time on in this webinar, but it is still really, really important in the way that we engage in the work.
Yeah, I just to add on to everything and applaud everything you said, Britt. I think, it makes me think that the worker, and I'll say the agency attitudes and culture, and I don't mean culture in a race and ethnicity sense, but like workplace culture, organizational culture, that to me lifts up as a risk or protective factor as well in so many ways. And I think we see that coming through in some of the other specific risk and protective factors that we've talked about today. But this idea of what is our messaging? How do we communicate to families? What is our reaction internally? When the family calls and says, I'm struggling with this, do we get off the phone and vent to our coworker saying, oh, the Smith family is, frustrated again. They won't stop asking for help. What is that doing to reinforce our agency culture? Where am I learning that if I'm the worker saying that? I've learned that that's something we do here, is that we sort of complain about it. And what I like to do is think about how could we flip that? Because to me, the agency culture and the values and beliefs, it's what we celebrate and it's the stories that we tell. So what if we celebrated this family reached out early on?
Yeah.
And said, I'm stuck with this. I don't understand this. They made themselves vulnerable. Let's applaud that to the family in an authentic way. Let's thank them for reaching out and reinforce that that's the behavior we want. Let's celebrate it. And I don't mean celebrate it, we get a cake and balloons, but let's look at it internally in the organization of great news. The family reached out, we're now trying to get them connected. Someone, earlier on, whoever trained them did a good job in letting them know that this is the right thing to do. But how can we make that part of the norm within our staff, that this is what we're looking for, not this is a burden that families are doing this. And I think, again, to that point, I think Britt used the language of it trickles down. I think that's another thing that trickles down if we're modeling that from a leadership level all the way to frontline staff and saying, we want this to be what families think of. We want them to reach out earlier. We want them to say, you know what, I don't even know what my question is, but here's what I'm stuck with. Mm-hmm. And we want that kind of openness. And some of you may be thinking, we can't take all of those phone calls right now. We can't handle that. But this is where we have to work upstream, to keep using that metaphor. If we had more of that, we would have fewer of the crisis calls ultimately. Yeah. But I think thinking about that in terms of, we're going a little bit astray from, I think, the question of how do our attitudes and outlook and communication affect the success? I think you can hear from Britt and me, we both think the answer is probably dramatically is, I think, the answer that we would give in shorthand. But thinking about it then, so what do we do with that? And we'd love to hear, see in the chat if any of you have thoughts on what has helped with that, or how attitude and communication has affected stability in your work. We'd be happy to have you share that in the chat. But yeah, I think thinking about it is how can that be an intentional thing that we're saying, we move this to what does success look like? And success might look like families reaching out earlier and families expressing questions or vulnerability. And it might mean us thinking about, great, I'm glad they're naming this now. It might mean having more conversations with families about their fears and their doubts, especially when we're in the matching process. But thinking about that as a shift and sort of what does practice look like from an agency and a system side. I think that also shifts it then, as Britt was talking, it shifts it from the blaming of this family failed this child.
Right.
And it moves it to, we have this responsibility. Now, in saying that, I also want to name that shifts it to, we have the responsibility. And I think it's important to name there's a defense mechanism here in putting the responsibility on that family didn't remember what we trained them on, or that family didn't work with the therapist well enough. That's a protective approach, a defense approach for us in the system to say it's not on us, it's someone else. And so I think that's a helpful thing to look at in terms of what's the kind of the grief and the vulnerability that it means that we have to take on, in addition to the other grief and loss and vulnerability to take on.
I really love naming it as a protective mechanism for ourselves, because like I don't want to suggest that any of this is easy and that chronic positivity in this field of work is at all easy. It is the most difficult work, in my humble opinion, that anybody can do. And so I don't want to imply that it's easy, but I like what Alicia said about like naming it for what it is, which is like, this thing happened and I'm feeling hurt because for this kid or for myself. And so that also goes to the support that we have internally for our staff. That means all of this is interconnected to our workforce health. And we know that we're all perpetually in a workforce crisis. So again, we're getting a little off topic. These are all really important and big conversations, and that we can continue to have these conversations in the peer meetings. But I just really appreciate the opportunity to talk with y'all about that.
Yeah. So I think with where we are with time, I think we have to wrap that up. So you got deep thoughts from Britt and Alicia on a couple of these questions. Maybe not what you were looking for, but hopefully that was helpful. But hopefully it leads into more conversation in the peer events.
And again, we have more questions that y'all have asked that we will, focus the peer meetings on. I want to encourage you guys as we close out here, small steps build into lasting action. So start the snowball, right? Start it rolling. And you'll, like if you just move the needle a little bit, I'm mixing my metaphors, you get the point. It's been almost 90 minutes, but basically encouraging you, take a step, take a stab at it, see if it helps, right? And a reminder again to join the peer meeting. If you haven't already registered, we're going to put the link in the chat one more time. And then as we're doing that, I'm going to leave it on. Thank you, Becky. You're the best. I'm going to leave it on my email address here. Folks are welcome to reach out to me and also to the consultation email at adoptiveskids.org. I think we're going to bypass the poll question that we were going to ask. We can do that at the peer meetings. Let's not worry about that. And then I also want to make sure folks know, as you're getting this resource roundup from me, you're going to get all of these resources we talked about, all of these resources and more. And so many resources, you guys, are available at professionals.adoptiveskids.org. We have tools. We have all of these recorded webinars. We have tip sheets. We have articles. We have resources for parent group leaders, right? So if you're like, oh, I wish that parent group leaders would discuss trauma's impact on behavior in their support group, well, look at that. We have a discussion guide on exactly that. What are the odds? So I just really want to encourage you guys to take a look there, especially as you're getting the resource roundup from us. Also if you're not already connected with our newsletter or with us on LinkedIn, we'd appreciate that. And one final reminder as we're closing here, you're going to be getting an email from Adoptive Kids Evaluation. We would love it if you would take 5 minutes to fill out that survey so that we can know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you want us to do differently, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, Jessica, in the post webinar email from me, with the resource roundup, you'll get a certificate for attendance. Everybody who was on live today will get that. So awesome, wonderful. Thank you guys so much for spending a Wednesday afternoon with us. We really appreciate it. We appreciate all of the thoughtful questions that were submitted in at registration. And we had about 450 or so, 475 people on here. So y'all are great. Great job. And y'all have a great rest of your day and take care.